back again, and we're covering a number of themes here. Mel, I brought on board. He's supposed to be on vacation. He refuses to do so. And so what he wants to do, he wants to now go back to this idea of the Masjid al Haram, Masjid al Haram, which we've always assumed meant the place of bowing, the forbidden place of bowing. But as we're going to see now, it is not the first. And if you want to find out where the Masjid al Haram is, it looks like the Masjid al Haram is in Jerusalem. But is it the first? Are we looking at the Dome of the Rock? Is that the first? Mel's going to introduce some brand new material, and this is stuff I've not heard before. This is stuff you've not heard before. But coming from Mel, you pretty well know that he's scratching the surface. He's scratching in there where the rocks are, and he's pulling up all these gems, these nuggets of gold. So over to you, Mel. God bless you. Let's see what you come up with, and let's see if we're convinced.
Okay. What I particularly like about this aspect of it is that we've got lots of early sources, reliable sources that we can depend upon, so we can really narrow down the dates and so on. So this is great. This is one of the rare times when we have got really good historical references. So we know from the written early sources that Umar entered Jerusalem in the period of 636, 637. There was a siege around that time, and Sophronius, I believe, allowed him in. I think it was 638. So we're talking, give or take a year or two in that time frame.
Actually, the invasion was 636 to 637, but Sophronius finally permitted them to come over and take over Jerusalem in 638. So that's why the date 638 is always given.
Yeah. So obviously the invaded Jerusalem, and one of the first places that Umar went to was the Temple Mount. So again, we're seeing the significance of it for the Saracens at that time. So we've got this really interesting source. Let me just move something out of my way here. John Damascus, writing the Spiritual Meadow in the 7th century. I'm just going to read directly from it down here. He gives us this little gem. He says, "The godless Saracens entered the holy city of Christ our Lord, Jerusalem, with the permission of God and in punishment for our negligence, which is considerable, and immediately proceeded in haste to the place which is called the capital. They took with them men, some by force, others by their own will, in order to clean that place and to build that cursed thing intended for their prayer, which they call a masjid. Sophronius excommunicated an archdeacon called John, a skilled marble worker, who did work on this building for pay." So this probably occurred in 638. And it's interesting that Sebius also tells a similar story. In his version of the story, there was some form of Jewish prayer hall that was there, and when Umar arrived, he basically took it over and then did building work on it to make it their own. So that shows you that this was the place of interest for them. And it's interesting, that's the earliest definite reference to a masjid by this group in the 7th century. And where is it? On the Temple Mount. Now, if we look at what happened next, the monk Anastasius of Sinai informs us that he had witnessed clearing work being undertaken on the Temple Mount in 660. And this is from Robert Hoyland, by the way. On Friday the 7th of June, 659, there was a violent earthquake in Palestine and many places there collapsed. Very likely the Mosque of Umar was one of the edifices affected, and it was therefore incumbent upon Muawiya to have the structure rebuilt. That both Umar and Muawiya undertook building projects on the Temple Mount is confirmed by certain of our sources. So this is really solid evidence that this is where the masjid was. And so when the text of the Quran was being written, presumably the early versions of it were being written and referring to the masjid, I believe that this is the masjid that we're talking about. Now it's interesting, my understanding of the Masjid al Haram is the forbidden place of prostration. But so Jay, you mentioned to me that Murad had mentioned another meaning for that word al Haram there in the context of the Masjid al Haram.
Yeah, for those of you who don't know who Murad is, he's one of our teammates who's lived in the Middle East, who speaks fluent Arabic and has done such a major amount of research looking at the Arabic and the Aramaic. And one of the things that he has said is that when you look at the word haram, we've always thought and assumed it meant the forbidden. But he says no. There's another, probably a stronger meaning for haram is hollow. That is the hallowed place. Now, when I asked him and questioned him, are you talking about then the hollow dome? He says, no, 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 the dome didn't exist. Remember, the dome wasn't there until 691. He says it's underneath is the hollow place. Is that significant for you, Mel?
It's hugely significant. I'm not going to break the surprise. I've got something really exciting to show you a little bit later, but keep that concept of the hollow
Oh, so you're going to
in
do
mind.
something new that I've not heard yet. Well, this is going to be
Yeah,
exciting. All right, let's go for
this
it.
is going to be new. So let's move this story forward a little bit. So we have a pilgrim's witness account in the year 670. A French bishop called Arcolf. He was on pilgrimage to Jerusalem. He got shipwrecked off the coast of Britain, and his account was recorded in Adomnan's writings. He was an Irish monk who wrote it down in 700 AD. So it's, a witness account. And here's what he says. He says, in that famous place where once stood the magnificently constructed temple near the eastern wall, the Saracens now frequent a rectangular house of prayer, which they have built in a crude manner, constructing it from raised planks and large beams over some remains of ruins. This house can, as it is said, accommodate at least 3,000 people. Do you notice the shape of it? It reminds me very much of the tabernacle.
Yeah, we talked about that in a previous episode.
Yeah, so essentially, you can see from the description, it pretty much matches what you find in the Old Testament. They were simply copying what the old tabernacle was. They wanted to build their version of the tabernacle where they would have the Holy of Holies in the corner, or the Kaaba, in other words. This is the location of the original Kaaba. And the area of it would have been about the size of an American football field, for those of you trying to visualize what we're talking about. Now, if we look at the timeline then, so this is when Umar builds the first masjid. Then an earthquake happens in 659. Then Muawiya builds a new masjid. And then 692, Abd al-Malik builds the Dome of the Rock. Something happened to the masjid, possibly in between those two dates. Or maybe Abd al-Malik decided to really put a beautiful building for that site, or put a beautiful building on that site for centuries to come. Obviously, the wooden building wouldn't last forever, so he decided this is a good time as any to build a really magnificent building, and obviously thumbing his nose at the Christian churches across the hills from there. So it was obviously a statement as well as...
Which is down below him, actually.
That's right.
Let me interject here. Go back to that timeline, just so people are aware. When we're referring to people like Umar and Muawiya and Abdul Malik, I hope you all know none of these are Muslims. Let me reiterate that. None of these are Muslims. We have pretty well substantiated that by looking at the coins, by looking at the rock inscriptions. There's nothing Islamic about all of them. Muawiya, in fact, has coins where he's holding a cross and has a cross above his head, proving that he was either a Christian. The coins that he mints over in Iran have the fire altars. So Umar, we know, is from Hira. We know that Muawiya is from Damascus. These are not Mecca and Medina, folks. Hira is what's present-day Kufa, which is over in the east in what is today Iraq. Damascus is way up, as you well know, way up in what is today Syria. So that if you have people like Muawiya, and Abdul Malik lives in Damascus as well, none of these people lived down in Mecca or Medina, down in Arabia at all. They all lived in what is today either Syria or Iraq. And that's why, be careful. People think, so this is proof that Islam existed and these are what they were doing. This is the precursor. No. None of these are Muslims. These are not Islamic structures at all. That's why, isn't it interesting what Mel's saying? Notice how similar that Muawiyah's masjid is to the tabernacle. Has anybody said that before, Mel? I think you're the first to discover that.
Yeah, possibly. But it's pretty obvious when you look at the description and you look at what the Bible says about it, they pretty much looked at the Bible and said, "Yeah, we'll build it exactly like that." So, nothing,
How
nothing
many times have
surprising
you
there.
heard us also talk about Abdul Malik's Dome of the Rock? The Dome of the Rock is not Islamic, it is Byzantine. It is Byzantine structure. The circumambulation was something that with the Byzantine structure, it was the best of its kind, the best Byzantine structure of its kind. So even as late as 692, they still did not have this view. They still were not Muslims. Now, Abdul Malik introduces that idea, and we've talked about this many times before. Back to you, Mel.
Yeah, so there's a surprise coming. So I want to talk about that hollow because we saw that the Masjid al Haram could mean the hollow.
Hidden or hollow. Haram.
Yeah. So okay, so you remember that place there, the place where Abraham was said to have sacrificed Isaac. This is called the sacra. The altar of Abraham is another name for it. And it contains a number of well-kept secrets. I love secrets, and I'm going to reveal a couple of these secrets to you today. And they are really embarrassing as well, which is even better. So the Dome of the Rock, its alternative name, obviously, is the Mosque of Omar or Umar. The bit that is significant here is there's a hole there in it. This hole that's in the rock is supposed to have been made for the purpose of carrying off the blood of the animals sacrificed on the rock. And if we look at it there's one hole. I think that was a shaft that was put down into the hollow below. Now, in Jewish traditions, the sacra is the place, as we said, where Abraham prepared to sacrifice his son Isaac. And there's the name for it there in Hebrew, which I'm not going to attempt to say. But under the sacra is a hollow. Where have we heard this before? It's actually referred sometimes as the Well of Souls. You can go down some steps. It derives from a medieval Islamic legend that at this place the spirits of the dead can be heard awaiting Judgment Day. Again, do you remember that reference to Judgment Day coming up again? And you notice there's mihrabs. I wonder where the mihrabs are pointing towards. Are they pointing to Mecca? Be interesting. We'll come to that in a moment. Now, there's lots of interesting Islamic folk stories associated with. The cave was venerated as early as 902. Muslim tradition likewise places it at the center of the world and over a bottomless pit with the flowing waters of paradise underneath. Again, showing you how important Jerusalem was. A palm tree is said to grow out of the river of paradise here to support the stone. Muslims believe that the sacra is suspended in the air and its only support is a palm tree held by the mothers of the two greatest prophets, Muhammad and Abraham. You'd imagine they'd have something better to be doing than holding that up. Noah is also said to have landed here after the flood, so they're really dumping lots of legends on this place. And an interesting one is there's a projecting point. It's called the tongue, because according to their story, when Umar thought he had discovered the stone which was Jacob's pillar in his vision, he exclaimed, "Peace unto thee," and the stone replied, "Peace be to thee and the mercy of God." So they even have a legend connecting Umar with a particular stone, but it gets better. There are 4 different qiblas in this cavern, and none of them are to Mecca. Are you aware of this?
No, this is the first time I'm hearing it.
So, as you go down the staircase, there are 2 mihrabs to the left. So, left, which is south, is the one dedicated to the prophet David. To the right, southeast, is a prayer niche dedicated to Solomon. I'll come back to that in a second. This mihrab is certainly one of the oldest in the world, considered to be, to date, at least back to the late 9th century.
When you say 9th century, you're saying BC or AD?
AD. Okay.
Okay.
And to the north is a small shrine dedicated to the prophet Abraham, and to the northwest another one dedicated to Elijah. So let me just go through these again. So in the northwest there's a mihrab dedicated to Elijah. I wonder why that is. When I looked into it, I found that northwest of there is Mount Carmel, where Elijah used to be. If we look at the next one, Abraham, why north of there? These are my suggestions, by the way. I may be wrong, but it kind of makes logical sense. So north of Jerusalem You can see there that Salam is Jerusalem, Mount Moriah, and north of there is Shechem. Shechem was the first location that Abraham went to when he entered Canaan. It's obviously a very important place. It's one of the stations of Abraham. South of there, another mihrab is to David's palace. There's that one there. And then the southeast one is towards Solomon. But I've been unable to find out what exactly is connected southeast of there. So if any of you know, perhaps we can solve that mystery. But none of them are directed towards Mecca. Isn't that incredible?
Can I have a question here?
Yeah.
If you're saying that the oldest one is the mihrab towards of Abraham's, is that what you're saying is the oldest one?
Let me see.
Or
I
the
think
Prophet
it's
Solomon. The one to Solomon is the
Solomon
oldest.
one.
That's not till 9th century AD. Then these were all introduced into the Haram, or the holy place, during the rule of Islam. Why would they put these four in there if these are all Muslim mihrabs?
Yeah. Now there is dispute. I've gone for the most conservative date here on this one. Some, including Dan Gibson, believes that this early mihrab might go back to the beginning of the 8th century. But obviously, I'm being the most conservative on this.
Nonetheless, it's after Abd al-Malik. That's still after Abd al-Malik, because that's 7th.
Yeah. So whichever way you play it, whether it's early or late, it's equally as damaging.
Yeah.
You know.
It's obviously, if it's 8th century, and you're going to say that the David and Abraham and Elijah would have been, those mihrabs would have been introduced around the same time or right after, immediately after Solomon. It seems to suggest, therefore, that these are still pre-Islamic.
Yeah, I would say so, and they're obviously, well, it's not necessarily obvious, but it's probably that there were pre-existing customs that the Jews had towards these places, and they've just carried them on. But obviously,
and could we at least agree on this, that these would be Umayyad? These probably would be Umayyad structures, not Abbasid. The Abbasids would have not included, because the Abbasids are the ones that take out all of this, anything that's biblical, and then introduce the idea of Muhammad and the Miraj coming on the back of the winged horse, Burak. They have to get him out of Mecca to get up there, so he has to come on a winged horse to then do the ascending the seven heavens. That is an Abbasid narration, or an Abbasid story.
I think this is one of those aspects that the Abbasids overlooked. This one, I think you're right that this is more than likely a Umayyad one, but it's highly embarrassing, it's highly damaging, because there's obviously this is obviously an indicator that in the early days the story was very different, and you can see that it's not pointing to Mecca. Why is there not a mihrab towards Mecca?
In fact, nothing is pointing to Mecca. Just go back again. We notice when you look at the Dome of the Rock, I'll just put this image of the Dome of the Rock again. Take a look. You notice the Dome of the Rock. You also have the Dome of the Chain. I'm just going to put an arrow to it. And then also look at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. All three of them, those are the three most important structures there on that whole citadel. They're all facing Petra. Not one of those three are facing Mecca.
Yeah. Okay, so there's the mihrab there. And just wanted to bring St. John of Damascus in as well, and this is something that I've mentioned before, so I'll just mention it briefly. He in the 730s he mocks the idea that they had a place that they were saying Abraham sacrificed Isaac, and he mentions down here at the bottom, he says that there's not wood for Abraham to cut down there, and it's not the place where you would leave donkeys. In other words, it's not a place that's suitable. So he was arguing that it doesn't fit with the Bible narrative. So that would suggest that they have moved the location from Jerusalem down to Mecca at this stage, because you don't have trees down there, and it's not a place for donkeys. It's obviously a place for camels. And and one other little thing before we finish there today is that we have a reference to the Caliph Mansur buildings on the site of Mecca in 754, expanding the area and so on. And this is in the Tab Akbar Makkah by the author Al-Azraqi, writing about 100 years afterwards. So before 754, there is almost no reference to Mecca. We have that 741 reference, but apart from that, that's it. So it all looks very much like Mecca took off sometime in the early part of the 8th century. But I think based on what I've shown you earlier on in this video, that it looks very much to me that really it was Jerusalem in the early days is where the focus was, and then it got shifted eventually down to Mecca. So that's it from me. Come back to you.
Here we go again. I mean, you're just coming up with gem after gem after gem. Just to summarize real quickly, like I like to do for those who are watching, you went through and you showed that there were other structures on the Dome of the Rock, and what you're trying to say, I'm sorry, on the Temple Mount and what Mount Moriah. And I think what is fascinating here, you're showing almost everything we are seeing that Islam has finally created or finally settled on during the Abbasid period. If you go back to the 7th century, as we've always asked you to do, when you go back to the 7th century, look and follow the evolution of how Islam finally created this. So what you have here is that this Masjid al Haram, that there is a masjid after masjid after masjid. You've pointed to 3 different ones already. Thanks so much, Mel. You talked about that John Damascus, who refers to the Masjid of Umar. Umar, who comes from Hira, which is today Kufa in Iraq. He invades, takes over Jerusalem in about 638, and he then refers to this masjid, but this John Damascus talks us about this cursed masjid. He's referring to how did this guy put this masjid up there, because this is a Jewish site. So you can already see there's antagonism between the Arabs and the Jews, even this early. We're talking about 638. Anastasius, then in 660, you talk about the time of, this is when, just before Muawiya comes to power in 661, and that Muawiya then builds the masjid there, rebuilds it in around 660, 661. Aruf or Arkuf in 670, then you refer to, talks about that the shape of this place that was built there was long, much like what we know as the Ark of the Covenant, or the Tabernacle. Sorry, not
Tabernacle, yeah.
The Tabernacle that you see in Judaism. So it still suggests, therefore, that these are either still Jews, or they still are biblical, or they are Christians, but they are still following the biblical text, the biblical context. And then you talk about the sacra, and you mentioned that the rock is haram, and we asked Murad, who came on and told us that actually that haram, it doesn't just mean forbidden. That's what Muslims have put to it. That's the imposition they have put on that word. It actually meant hollow. So the hollow masjid, or the hollow place of bowing. Well, if you take a look today, it's still there, and that's underneath the rock. I didn't know this. This is good that you're bringing this up. This hollow below the rock. And when you looked at that, you said if you go down there, you will notice that there are not just one mihrab. Now, for people who don't know what a mihrab is, if you were to go into any mosque today, anywhere in the world, you will see a niche that's put at where the whole masjid is facing, and that would be the prayer point. That's where the prayers go. That is the mihrab that would show where the qibla was. That means the direction of prayer. Well, you said that there are 4 of these mihrabs that have been placed down there, and they are even named. And it's fascinating, the names you gave to them. You have one that is named, that's going towards the northwest. That's the Elijah mihrab. You have one that's going straight north, that's facing, you say, Shechem, which is the Abrahamic mihrab. You have one that's facing straight south, which would be the Davidic mihrab. And then you have one facing southeast, southeast, which would be Solomon's mihrab. Fascinating, because these are all introduced sometime in the 7th and beginning of the 8th century, and which would suggest that these are Umayyad mihrab. So somewhere along during the Umayyad period, you have this view, this still very strong biblical view, that Jerusalem is the center of everything, and these mihrabs are pointing to historical places that the great prophets either lived in or had something to do with, or was important to their story. We still don't know about Solomon. You've asked people to go in and come up, if they can come up with any response to that. And then you ended with John of Damascus, and you mentioned that John of Damascus is in 730. So you're well into the 8th century now. He's there in Damascus. He's there in the courts of the Umayyads still. They're weakening and weakening and weakening. And the Abbasids still haven't come to power, and he mocks them. And he says, why are you now talking about this place where the sacrifice is going on? He knows it's in Jerusalem and Mount Moriah, but now it's been changed to another place that has no wood. Well, what has no wood? Where is a place that's devoid of any vegetation? That's Mecca. So it looks like around the 730s, that's when Mecca is chosen, which fits exactly our timeline. This fits our timeline perfectly. And if you just scratch around, you can see how this all fits together. I love this, Mel. So by looking at the masjid, Paul introduced it in his talk and his video. You've taken it a step further, says, let's continue with that masjid. Let's look and see why Jerusalem is so important. Not only because it's important in the 7th century, it's important to the rulers who were there, Umar, and certainly Muawiya, and Abdul Malik. It's important to all three. They may not have the same reasons. Abdul Malik was much more of a political reason because he is confronting the Byzantine Christianity, and that's why he puts those inscriptions there on the inner ambulatories. But they all are they're all in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is hugely significant because this is where always God has met his people. Mecca was not important, even as late as 691. 730, this is the first time I've heard you say this, and this is terrific. It looks like we're going to look at the early 8th century to understand where this is now being brought down to Mecca. And it looks like that Mecca from there on out becomes then the place of importance. Once you choose Mecca, you've got to give it a story. You've got to give it a history. You've got to give it significance. So what do? You take that which is in Jerusalem, you bring it down, which has probably been also in Petra, and you bring it down to Mecca. And are you all watching this? Are you all following this? Are you seeing where we're going with this? We are, in some ways, just by looking at what's happening in the 7th and 8th century, we're recreating how Islam really began. We're seeing these origins form right in front of us. Follow the path where it leads. Mel, you, Paul, Joe, Murad, you've done us a great favor because you're helping us and leading us along that path. God bless you. Thanks for your time.
My pleasure, Jay. Thank you very much.